Today we're here to talk about the, actually what are we here to talk about? No, it says we're here to talk about legal and regulatory change in China and its impact on private equity. And I'm very lucky to be joined here by two people who know the subject extremely well. On my right, I have Will Hare, who is the General Counsel at Baring Private Equity, and who is a very experienced investor in and observer of China and private equity in China. And on my left I have Brian Schwarzwalder, who is a partner at Rose & Gray, and like Will has extensive experience helping private equity firms and corporates invest in China, and he knows the scene very well. I will let both of them very briefly talk a little bit about their experience, and then we can jump into the main topic. So Will, do you want to go first?
Well, I was going to say that it's a little strange in this audience to have three, well, you're talking to everybody about events in China, so I encourage everyone who knows, everyone here undoubtedly knows far more than we do, to jump in at any moment. I've been working in China for 30 years, and I've sort of watched the great opening up as it's proceeded, and I still remain very, very positive on the market. It's a very exciting time with Xi Jinping taking over, and the next 5 years are going to be much more interesting than the last 10 years, I think.
Well, and I've been working in China since about 1993, and have spent the last 10 years here in Hong Kong doing private equity investments around the region, but with a focus on China. So I've seen quite a bit of the changes in the private equity industry over that time. And if the next 5 years are going to be more interesting than that, then that's really something to look forward to. So it's been an interesting time of change and development and opportunity, and I think Will's right that that's going to continue.
To begin with, I'd love to get your thoughts on sort of recent changes. I think at the state council level, as we were discussing the other day, there are a lot of liberals in place. They seem to implicitly understand the benefits of private equity, and that's naturally a good thing, but are there reasons we should sort of temper our optimism going forward? Where do you see sort of obstacles?
Well, there's the macro story in China is how to release the entrepreneurial forces in the economy. In the past 10 years, I think there was perhaps some stasis. The SOEs tended to get a little stronger, unfortunately, in trade. And now the macroeconomic situation is such that to continue sustained growth, that has to be addressed. And the think tank people are on the State Council. Most of us have met them. They're brilliant people. They have very, very strong views of how macroeconomics can help growth in a society. And so we've seen a wave of proposals to free the currency, to reduce the monopolies in the state sector, emanating from those sources. But we've also seen perhaps passive resistance, even active pushback from the people whose relative position might be diluted by that, and that would namely be the SOE structures, which have gotten much, much stronger over the last 10 years. So I think it's a classic. We've seen this in Japan. We've seen it in Korea. This is not a unique problem to China, but it's one that needs to be addressed. And I think one theory about the anti-corruption campaign that Xi Jinping has put his reputation behind is it's an instrument, a blunt instrument to be sure, but that's an instrument that can be wielded against people who perhaps don't see the world the way he does. And I deeply believe that he is committed to whatever helps China grow and get more strong. And if somebody stands in his way, then he's going to try to push them aside.
Right.
And I think one other dynamic to just keep an eye on is how level the playing field is between onshore funds and offshore investors. I don't see the current system requiring approvals for foreign investment going anywhere anytime soon, but to watch how that liberalizes, watch how the relative amount of bureaucracy that stands in the way between offshore investors and onshore investors plays out over time. And I think that will be a give and take process, because again, I think the overall direction is clear of encouraging foreign investment, encouraging private equity, but the opportunities that present themselves and the way to take advantage of those does get impacted by how the regulatory framework impacts onshore versus offshore investment structures and restrictions and availability of opportunities.
One thing we discussed last week was specific industries that are going to benefit or suffer under the current regime or under the current sort of administration and sort of within the current legal context. Will, do you have any thoughts on?
I think a major secular trend is the middle class is exploding in China. There are probably 300, 400 million people who qualify as middle class in the Chinese context. And they have increasing disposable income, and that is reflecting itself in a large variety of investment opportunities. Everything from retail concepts to vacations abroad. As many of you know, we have a high profile in for-profit education. We've invested in an online internet game, which is the price point is basically it's a middle class consumption item. So that I think is just one trend that is going to be huge for all of us in this room. There are other sectors around alternative energy, financial liberalization, similar things, but that's a little harder. You have to try to it's a little more difficult to get leverage into some of those sectors.
Brian, what have you seen unfold in the last 18 months?
Yeah, I think one other very interesting sector to keep an eye on is healthcare and life sciences, because you've seen very strong political statements that China wants to improve its healthcare system between now and 2020, and that liberalization of foreign investment rules will be part of that. And one of the first things that we've seen is a pilot program that's allowing for foreign ownership of hospitals, initially on a pilot program basis in 7 cities and provinces. But I think that's part of a larger story that is going to enable foreign investment in a variety of different parts of the healthcare and life sciences sectors. And I think that's directly related to the growing middle class and people wanting to have access to higher quality healthcare institutions, even if it comes at a greater cost. And I think kind of some related industries around that, including insurance, will also be the beneficiaries of that liberalization and provide foreign investment opportunities.
But I think many people in this room were expecting sort of wide-ranging regulatory and legal change that have a significant sort of positive impact on private equity, but how is that counterbalanced by slowing economic growth in particular, but also by valuations which remain high?
Well, I mean, regulation can certainly help drive investment into certain sectors, but if the fundamental business case is not there, that alone is not going to drive investment. I think, Will can speak to what he sees his deal team is looking at. But I think where there are sectors where you have both a lot of sort of pent-up demand for investment and liberalization, where the playing field is wide open, like healthcare, certainly there, opening the door is going to result in a lot of investment going in. Education, I think, would be similar. But the regulation alone is not going to drive investment in all cases.
Yeah, it keeps it out of the most restricted sectors, but everything else is economically driven. I think that's.
Will, if I can ask you another question, I mean, as you said earlier, you've been looking at China for a generation. You've seen sort of extensive change. I mean, if you were to drill down on three areas, where would you like to see further change to make China a more attractive, more appealing market for private equity?
Well, this comes under the heading of evil foreign forces, suggesting these kind of ideas. But I mean, obviously, a freely convertible currency, an end to some of the more protectionist investment restrictions, and the creation of a commercial court system that would be more professional than the existing court system. I think those are, there are probably 5 more I could come up with at a moment's notice. But again, these are things I've worked in Korea, Japan, Taiwan, Southeast Asia, and these are things that emerge, over a period of time. In one generation, this isn't enough to achieve that.
Where do you think China is in the cycle? I mean, I guess that it's, in Japan at its height, you could have plausibly argued that the legal system there was maybe a generation behind the economy in terms of its development. Do you see the Chinese legal system catching up? Do you see it?
Well, I mean, the reason I sort of made a joke about foreign influence is the Chinese fundamentally see the legal system in a different way than people in the West do. The Chinese legal system only a small part of it goes to court and wears official uniforms. By far the bulk of it is effectively informal social mediation, where people find somebody who knows somebody, and when there's the dispute, people have they talk about it, they have a banquet, and they sort something out. And so that is, I think Chinese people are most comfortable with sort of the win-win, save-face method of resolving disputes, at least in a context where there's some level of relationship. And I mean, that's not unlike Japan and the rest of Confucian Asia. So it's, and the difficulty with that is, as a foreigner, you don't really plug into that world. You don't really have somebody to call. You have to really spend a lot of effort making the connections of people who can speak up for you if you need intercessions at some point. So I would say that the Chinese legal system has always been a slightly different trajectory than sort of the investor-friendly, OECD structure of legal systems.
Brian, have you seen sort of offshore funds and your other clients using legal services in China in a different way since Xi Jinping came to power?
I don't know that I've seen a change directly correlated to sort of Xi Jinping coming into power. I do think, going back to the anti-corruption campaign, I think that has been something that has definitely impacted our clients' behavior and their attitudes towards doing deals in China. There are, when I first came out here 10 years ago, there weren't that many funds that paid a lot of attention to FCPA and anti-corruption issues in China. Now I think it's universal, and I think there's a well-trodden path in terms of the basic amount of diligence that you need to do on corruption issues going into an investment that maybe has been heightened as a result of the anti-corruption regime, and people paying more attention to how do you respond to any red flags that arise in the course of that diligence. People are also paying more attention to how you monitor your investments going forward, not just doing the diligence, getting some reps and warranties in your documentation, and then letting things go for the course of your holding period, but actually paying attention on a regular basis, whether it's through board reporting or development of a compliance program, to what's actually happening, whether there are any specific activities within the business that are high-risk activities that you want to change, and then also preparing people for the possibility of an AIC or a PSB investigation of the company, making sure that people on the ground know what to do if they get a visit from AIC or PSB, making sure documents are kept properly, making sure you've got appropriate intervention by your legal advisors at the time that investigation starts, so that you can help get to the best outcome.
In our work as well, we've seen a number of US listed funds and also many of the US corporates that we work for post GSK be much more proactive around sort of compliance and governance and diligence in general. We haven't seen quite the same shift among sort of regional funds, but they're definitely sort of inching across as well. And maybe, Will, you could, since you're a Hong Kong-based fund, maybe you could share with us some of your thoughts about how to approach these issues or how you're approaching them.
Well, I would say that even, 15 or 20 years ago, it was the rare group that took that seriously, and obviously the increase in prosecutions in the U.S., the British Bribery Act, the OECD Convention, over the last 10 years in the West have driven a lot of attention that way. And the funds that are domiciled in the West have felt the full brunt of that, and so they've been at the forefront of compliance. Even though we and our regional brethren are regionally based, our limited partner base tends to be disproportionately from the OECD countries. And when we go on roadshows for fundraising, we're getting questions, how do you handle the FCPA questions? And it isn't enough to say, well, we're not a US person under the definition, so it doesn't apply to us, because it's not the technical issue whether you comply or not, it's the governance issue. Are you taking it seriously, or are you up to international standard? And so I think we're all, we're maybe a step behind the U.S. funds and the British funds in coming into compliance with that. But it's been a high agenda for us. And the killer argument is, if you go into a position and if you're utterly a non-American fund and you invest in a company that's absolutely no connection to the U.S., you can still be tagged by FCPA when you sell to a strategic. Even if it's a foreign strategic that has securities listed in New York, it's FCPA compliant. And they'll come through, and if they find something, their get-out-of-jail-free card is they tell the U.S. Justice Department about it. So the risk on exit it applies to everybody who's doing deals of any size in Asia.
I was chatting the other day with the co-founder of a regional fund, and we were talking about FCPA and the UK Bribery Act. And if you kind of stick to the letter of the law, you don't have a business. So where do you draw the line? What level of documentation do you need? What level of infrastructure do you need around governance and compliance to sleep well at night?
Well, it's important to realize that, I'm also a New Yorker. I worked in New York for 15 years before I came back to Asia. Petty corruption exists in New York. More than petty corruption exists in New York. And the FCPA was modeled on the domestic U.S. law that prevents that. And people avoid prosecution in the U.S. by doing common sense things. It's not a guarantee that no corruption exists in your organization. It's a guarantee that you took responsible measures to try to figure out where the biggest risk is and put measures into place to reduce that risk in a way that an intelligent, responsible business person would do so. So you can go into any small business in Queens, New York, and you'll find as many violations as you will in Guangzhou in terms of compliance. The question is, are the leaders of the firm acting in a compliant manner? Is there a risk that some rogue employee is going to go off without detection and do something that will bring the company down? So there is a cost-benefit analysis and a balancing of enforcement versus perfection that's implicit in all of this.
Brian, you must see a lot of people juggling this issue. How has it changed in the last year or so?
Yeah, I think people have gotten a bit more sophisticated about it, as Will was alluding to there. There are different risks that you're trying to solve for as a fund. One is the risk that the business will take a hit from a Chinese investigation. Another is that the SEC or the DOJ will come after you as an investor in the business. And the types of actions that you need to take to cover off those risks are different, and the extent to which you want to go, it is a cost-benefit analysis, and it depends on what your investment profile is. Are you talking about a control investment where you're going to have the majority of the members of the board in a high-risk industry like healthcare, or are you talking about a small minority passive investment in a business that is not in a high-risk industry and doesn't have a whole lot of government contacts, the types of things that you would ask for in the documentation and that you would expect the company to adopt as part of your investment are very different in those two different scenarios. But I think people are able to take a more nuanced look at things and understand what they do want to do in order to cover off the risks for them.
My sense is we've covered much of the ground here, and rather than...
Can I toss one more
Yeah, go ahead.
And that is the accumulation of capital by Chinese individuals is absolutely astonishing. Everyone knows that. We see the wealth management products, the trust products, bank loans, domestic M&B funds. This was not a feature of our lives 10 years ago. So the whole discussion is against what is Chinese capital doing? Where do we as foreigners or as quasi-foreigners have the ability to play? Can we raise M&B funds? Can we open the door that way? And so that is causing huge changes in the market. There's still opportunities for nimble players, particularly when there's a cross-border element, either a skills transfer or businesses moving outward. But that's one of the things that makes this particularly exciting time. And the new regulations encouraging capital to flow offshore have been a real benefit. That's really critical.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I think that is probably the sector where we've seen the most positive developments. Again, I think that's partly political, the government wanting to encourage outbound investments by limiting the filings and registration requirements on outbound investment. Also, the cross-border security rules that have come out this year are also facilitating that in a number of important ways. So I agree. I think that's an area where the private equity has some experience so far partnering with sources of Chinese capital, but there's a lot more to develop along those lines.
Okay, and I'll go back to my previous point. I think we've covered most of the ground, so I'd love to take questions from the audience.
Come on, Scott, I know you want to ask a question.
Several.
Yeah, as an interrogator. Just in terms of capital coming out of the country, there's an awful lot of it. Some of it is normal and expected asset diversification. Some of it is perhaps an attempt to safeguard assets. But I wonder what the experiences are, people around the room here are, what types of expectations the high net worths have with the capital that they're exporting out of China. I see a lot of very strange economics. Looks like it's distortions or residue of distortions from the shadow banking system, but I'd be very curious to see what the other people that are working either in private equity or liquid capital investments.
Well, capital preservation, I think, would rank very high. An entrepreneur in China, there's a thing in the newspaper today that something like 60 to 80% of Chinese want their kids to go overseas to go to school, and that usually involves at some point getting a foreign passport and planting the flag of the family overseas. And I think it's a very common theme that the dad is making the money at home, and in order to guarantee that for the generations to come, somehow it has to go offshore because it's just not. There's no way to guarantee its transition if it's all sitting onshore. I think I see that in many different contexts that people are into.
We actually see this. I'm based in Singapore, and Singapore is awash in mainland Chinese money, and just thinking about my kids and some of their classmates, their parents have started successful businesses in China and are very hastily relocated or have hastily relocated themselves to Singapore. Thinking about a project we're working on right now for a real estate client, they've suddenly ended up with a very large mainland Chinese investor. They're a listed company, and out of nowhere suddenly a Chinese billionaire has bought 18% of their equity. And that's perhaps a slightly extreme case, but it's very clear that money is flowing overseas at a rate that none of us have experienced before, and I think it's, I mean, Brian was just saying that PE investors are still getting to grips with how to partner with Chinese money as it goes overseas, but I don't think it's just PE, I think it's everybody.
Well, real estate, I think, is a little further ahead of the curve. It's an easier asset to underwrite. It's not a people business necessarily, and Chinese definitely understand real estate. So, taking North America, if you go around New York, the Bay Area, LA, you see a lot of people with Q's and X's and Z's in their name, running businesses that have real estate involved, and they're doing a very, very good job. And that is a for-profit operation. Some of the perhaps more passive investments are in equities. It strikes me as more of a capital preservation play at this point. But then you see the Chinese tech companies are all setting up in Silicon Valley. They're at the stage where they're international level players. Alibaba is as strong as Apple is in terms of recruiting talent and bidding for small companies to absorb. And so that's probably the next non-capital preservation, really true international M&A that will happen.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think if you look at Chinese corporates like that with a lot of cash on the balance sheet, being able to give upstream or offshore guarantees, going out and looking for acquisition targets, that's going to be a huge source of M&A activity in the coming years. I think you're also seeing, in terms of high net worth individuals, you're seeing founders who maybe have sold out their China business that are now looking at, they understand an industry really well. They understand how assets in places like Australia or Southeast Asia might tie into a Chinese business, and they're looking at opportunities to go out and acquire small businesses around the region, getting some offshore funding, putting in some equity or debt themselves, then roll those up and look for a sale to a Chinese strategic. And I think those are the types of opportunities that are becoming more and more feasible, where that entrepreneur knows the industry but doesn't necessarily know how to do those deals, and partnering up with a fund who's done those deals is and can provide part of the capital is a really attractive option that's there that wasn't as easy to pull off 18 months or 2 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, we're actually starting to see that in Europe as well, and in North America. So I think that it's certainly the greatest level of activity or I guess interest is in Southeast Asia, maybe even in Japan to a more limited degree, but even in Europe, even in North America, we're seeing Chinese corporates which at this point have technology which is cutting edge and goes beyond what their rivals in Western Europe and North America have managed to develop, are actually looking to move overseas to make those acquisitions. And I think that it's going to be a very interesting sort of 5 to 10 years for Western corporates as they find themselves increasingly sort of part of large Chinese conglomerates that have both the technology and the capital to really reshape themselves and reinvent themselves as Chinese multinationals.